Nobody tells you that the family you build can matter less to you than the family you were born into forgetting. I didn't understand that in one dramatic moment. It came to me sideways. In pieces I kept finding excuses to explain away, because I was 63 years old, a widower for 6 years, and for the first time since my wife passed, I was happy again in a way that embarrassed me a little. Her name was Diane, and for 16 months, I believed she was the second chance I didn't think I'd get. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For those of you just joining me, my name is Walter Kowalski. I spent 38 years running an HVAC and sheet metal company out of Scranton, Pennsylvania. The kind of business my own father started in 1961 with one truck and a toolbox he still had in our garage when he died. I took it over at 29, grew it into something that put 3 of my nephews through college, and sold it 4 years ago to my foreman, a good man named Ray who still calls me boss out of habit. Money was never the point in our house. Family was the point, always family. We're Polish-American, 3 generations in Lackawanna County, and my people don't do anything halfway. My late wife Barbara and I raised 2 daughters in the same house on Providence Road where I still live. Sunday dinner at my sister Connie's is not a suggestion, it's a law of physics. My brother-in-law Marek shows up unannounced with a case of Yuengling like he's paying rent. We are loud, we hold grudges about pierogi recipes, and we notice everything about the people our family loves. So when I tell you I met Diane at a hospital fundraiser gala in April, and that 4 months later I was more certain about something than I'd been about anything since 1987, understand what that means coming from a man my age. I wasn't looking. My daughters had been gently pushing me toward getting back out there for 2 years, and I'd wave them off every time. I don't fall easily. I especially don't fall easily at 63, when you've already buried the person you thought was the only one. Diane felt different from the first conversation. She walked into that ballroom in a green dress and laughed at a joke my brother-in-law told about kielbasa within 10 minutes of meeting him. And then she turned to me and asked, genuinely, not politely, where I'd learned to two-step, because apparently I still had it. My daughter Kristen grabbed her arm and talked to her for 45 minutes at the dessert table while I stood there like a teenager. That's how you know, in my family. If my daughters adopt you before I've even asked for your number, you're already halfway home. I proposed on the pier at Presque Isle in Erie on a Tuesday evening in late June because Tuesdays felt like ours somehow, no crowds, just us. Ring, sunset, the whole thing. She said yes before I finished the sentence. My daughter Kristen cried on the phone. My daughter Amy said, "Finally, Dad. Now bring her to Sunday dinner so Aunt Connie can feed her properly." Even my brother-in-law claimed he'd known since the fundraiser. To this day, I don't know how I managed to be that happy, genuinely, completely happy, and have absolutely no idea what was being built underneath it. Here's what I need you to understand about Diane before anything else. She wasn't cold. She wasn't distant. She was warm, funny, and she made me feel, constantly, like I'd earned something I didn't think I still got to have at my age. So when the subject of her family came up, and it came up early because in my world family comes up immediately, her answer didn't feel like a warning sign. It felt like a wound. My parents and I don't speak. She told me one night, maybe 5 weeks in, sitting on her back porch in Erie with 2 glasses of wine going warm between us. They were hard people when I was young, controlling, critical, especially my father. I had to put real distance between us just to become a functioning adult. They won't be at the wedding. I need you to understand that going in. I told her it didn't matter to me, and I meant it, because I trusted her, because she'd never once given me a reason not to. What I hadn't fully accounted for was my family. Not that they were hostile toward Diane. They weren't, not even close. But the Kowalskis operate on a specific frequency, and that frequency includes a deep need to know the people connected to the people we love. It isn't nosiness. It isn't judgment. We just believe you understand a person better once you understand where they came from, who raised them, and what table they sat at as a kid. By the 10th month of our engagement, the silence around Diane's family had started making its own kind of noise. It came to a head on a Sunday night in late August. Connie had made her golabki, the real recipe, the one that takes most of Saturday, and we were all around the table, Me, Diane, Connie, Merrick, my daughter Amy and her husband when Merrick, operating as always without regard for social tact, set down his fork and looked at Diane. Diane, sweetheart, I gotta ask you something. She smiled. Sure, Merrick. Where's your people at? We've been together a year and I ain't met a soul who shares your blood. The table went quiet the way it does when someone says the thing everyone's been carefully avoiding. Diane's smile held, but her eyes shifted, just barely. My parents and I aren't in contact. I've mentioned that. I know you mentioned it. I'm asking about it. Merrick wasn't being cruel. He was being Merrick. Because in our family, and I say this with love, you don't marry into a family you've never once laid eyes on. It's not how we do things. Marek, my voice, one low word. He picked his fork back up, but the question was already on the table, and no amount of Golabki was burying it. Later, after Diane had gone home, my sister found me in the kitchen. She poured herself a small glass of wine and leaned against the counter. She's a good woman, she said. Not a question. She is. I believe that. Connie nodded slowly. But Walter, we're going to be standing in street. Stanislas. We're going to make promises in front of God and everybody we know, and we're going to do it without ever laying eyes on a single person from her family. Her parents were toxic, Connie. I believe her. She set the glass down. I believe you believe her. But toxic people still live somewhere, Walter. They got an address. I didn't say anything. She patted my shoulder and went back to the dining room. I stood in my sister's kitchen a long time after that. But here's what you need to understand. I still wasn't suspicious. Not, exactly, not, of Diane. If anything, I was worried about myself. Because the thought I couldn't shake, the one that kept surfacing on the drive back to Providence Road, was this. What if her parents took one look at me and decided I wasn't what they wanted for their daughter? I know how that sounds coming from a man who built a company from a single truck. But Diane moved through a very specific world. She'd spent 22 years in hospital administration. She served on 2 charity boards. Her friends had graduate degrees and opinions about wine regions I'd never heard of. Her condo looked like something out of a magazine. She carried herself with a particular polish that I found beautiful, but that sometimes, quietly, made me feel a little too loud, a little too Scranton, a little too much like a man who still called it supper. What if her parents were the same? What if they had money, standards, expectations I didn't know about? What if they looked at me and Diane saw all of it through their eyes and something shifted? I want to be straight with you. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't dig through her phone. I did something much simpler and much more old-fashioned. I found her father's name on an old holiday card Diane had once mentioned throwing away Harold and Ruth Whitfield of a small town called Corey, about an hour southeast of Erie. I looked them up the way you'd look up anybody, an old address, a landline still listed in Harold's name. And on a Saturday morning in early September, when Diane thought I was at Ray's shop looking at a truck he wanted my opinion on, I got in my car and drove to Corey, Pennsylvania, alone. I told myself I wasn't investigating. I told myself I just wanted to see, for my own peace of mind, whether Diane's parents were the kind of people who'd sit across a card table planning to disapprove of me before I ever opened my mouth. I wasn't ready for what I actually found. Corey is a small town, the kind with 1 stoplight downtown and a Dollar General that counts as a mall. Harold and Ruth's place was a modest ranch house on a street called Sycamore, with a chain-link fence, a bird feeder shaped like a little red barn, and a wheelchair ramp built onto the front porch that looked homemade but sturdy. There was no gate, no fancy car in the driveway, nothing that said, intimidating. I sat in my car for a long 10 minutes before I got out. Ruth answered the door. She was maybe 70, small, in a cardigan, and she looked at me with the particular caution of a woman who doesn't get many strangers on her porch. I told her my name, told her I was engaged to her daughter, and watched her hand go to her chest like she'd been struck. Diane, she said, like the word cost her something. You knew our Diane. She invited me in before I even finished explaining myself, calling over her shoulder, Harold. Harold, come here. It's about Diane. Harold rolled into the front room in a wheelchair, a big man gone thin, wearing a faded Steelers sweatshirt, oxygen tubing looped over his ears. He looked at me for a long moment, and something crossed his face that I understand now was hope. The specific kind of hope people stop letting themselves feel because it hurts too much when it doesn't pan out. They didn't sound toxic. They didn't sound controlling. What they sounded like, within the first 5 minutes, was two people who had been quietly grieving their daughter for 6 years. Ruth told me Diane had stopped speaking to them not because of anything they'd done to her, but after a bitter falling out over their decision to sign the family's small hardware store, Harold's father's store, over to Diane's younger brother, instead of splitting it between the two kids. Diane had wanted her half in cash. Harold's heart had already started failing by then, and he didn't have it, not liquid, not without selling the store out from under the son who'd actually worked in it for 15 years. Diane called them selfish, called it a betrayal, said if they couldn't treat her fairly, they didn't need to be in her life at all. She changed her last name back to her mother's maiden name on everything but her legal documents, moved to Erie, and simply stopped answering. On the mantel, still 6 years later, sat two framed photos of Diane, one from her college graduation, one from a Christmas that must have been the last good one. Ruth kept a shoebox of birthday cards she'd mailed every year to an old forwarding address, most of them returned unopened, a few simply never acknowledged. Harold, it turned out, had a defibrillator implanted 18 months ago after a scare that Diane never knew about, because there was nobody left to tell her. I sat in that ranch house on Sycamore Street for 2 hours, and I thought about the whole drive down, my rehearsed explanations, my quiet dread of not being good enough for these people. And here I'd been terrified of being judged by parents who would have given anything just to be invited back into a room with their daughter in it. The difference between a good liar and a great one is that the great one never breaks character, not even at the table, not even when the whole thing is coming apart underneath them. I didn't confront Diane that night. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I drove back to Scranton a little after 4, sat in my driveway for a solid 15 minutes, and made a very deliberate decision. Not yet. Not because I was scared. Not because I doubted what I'd just seen and heard on Sycamore Street. But because I'm my father's son, and my father taught me something about timing before a confrontation that most people get backwards. He used to say, "Walt, the man who reacts first almost never wins. Let people finish the lie. A half-told lie is just an argument. A whole lie is a confession." I went inside. Diane called that evening to ask how the truck shopping went, and I told her Ray's truck ran rough on the highway, which was even true. She said she missed me. I said I missed her too, and meant it, and hated a little that I meant it while sitting on what I now knew. Over the following 2 weeks, I started listening differently. Not suspiciously, I was careful about that. I didn't check her phone. I didn't follow her. I just listened. The way you listen once you finally understand that every conversation has been running on 2 levels at once and you've only been hearing one of them. I noticed she'd started mentioning a couple named Gordon and Ellen Marsh more than she ever had before. Gordon, she said, was a longtime family friend, practically a father figure since her own parents were out of the picture. Ellen adored her like a daughter. They'd love to meet me sometime. Small mentions, nothing alarming. The kind of thing a person drops into conversation when they're trying to get someone used to a name before that name needs to matter. I looked Gordon Marsh up from my den one evening with the door shut. He was the semi-retired former CFO of the hospital network where Diane worked, 68 years old, silver-haired, the kind of easy confidence that comes from decades of never having to explain yourself to anybody. His wife Ellen showed up in a photo from a hospital foundation gala 2 years back. Elegant, polished, exactly the picture of a comfortable, respectable older couple. Precisely the kind of people you'd want standing beside you if you were trying to convince a close-knit Pennsylvania family that you came from somewhere impressive. That's when I understood Diane wasn't just someone hiding an estrangement. She was someone who had built an entire second set of parents to replace the real ones sitting in a ranch house in Corey, still keeping a shoebox of unopened cards. I spent the next 3 weeks the way I imagine a man spends the weeks before a trial he intends to win quietly. I confirmed the wedding invitation list with the venue coordinator, a woman named Patty at the Scranton Cultural Center who'd handled 2 of my nephew's weddings and trusted me enough to let me look over the seating chart for family reasons. Sure enough, there they were, Gordon and Ellen Marsh, seated at the second table, listed on the program as parents of the bride, not step-parents, not family friends, parents. I drove past Sycamore Street once more, just to sit outside for a few minutes without going in, the way you visit a grave to think rather than to grieve. Then I went home and, for the first time since Barbara passed, I called my daughters and told them everything. Kristen went quiet on the phone for a long time before she said, "Dad, what are you going to do?" I told her I already knew. The wedding was set for a Saturday evening in late October, at the Scranton Cultural Center, a beautiful old Masonic temple turned event hall that Barbara and I had actually attended a benefit dinner in decades earlier. 210 guests. Diane's entire hospital foundation circle, my whole loud, unstoppable family, and, seated quietly at table 2 under false names, 2 people who had never met Diane's real parents in their lives. I didn't tell Diane what I knew. I let her plan every last detail: the flowers, the string quartet, the seating chart with Gordon and Ellen listed as her parents in gold script on the program. I let the lie run all the way to its own finish line, because my father was right. A whole lie is a confession, and I wanted the whole thing on the record before I said a single word. On the morning of the wedding, I drove down to Corey one final time, in my good suit, and asked Harold and Ruth Whitfield if they would come to Scranton that evening. I told them everything, gently, the way you tell people something that will hurt before it helps. Ruth cried at her kitchen table. Harold gripped the arms of his wheelchair and didn't speak for a long moment, and then he said, "I don't want to ruin her day, Walter." I told him he wasn't going to ruin anything. He was going to finish something that had been left broken for 6 years. My daughter Amy drove down with a wheelchair-accessible van, and we brought them back to Scranton together, Ruth clutching a small handbag in her lap the whole way, Harold staring out the window like a man watching a life go by that he thought he'd never get to be part of again. The ceremony itself, I let happen. I stood at that altar and said my vows to Diane, and meant every word of them, because whatever she'd built out of fear and shame with her real parents, the woman standing in front of me loving me was not entirely a lie, and I needed her to understand that distinction later. It was at the reception, during the toasts, that I asked for the microphone. I looked slowly around that ballroom full of round tables and string lights. My father taught me that the people you invite to stand up with, you reveal exactly who you are. I paused. So I want to make sure we have the right people standing up with us tonight. I nodded to Patty by the side entrance. She'd been briefed. She knew her cue. She opened the door, and Harold Whitfield rolled through it in his wheelchair, Ruth walking beside him with her chin up and her hand resting on his shoulder, moving with the quiet dignity of a woman who had decided, whatever happened next, she was not going to fall apart in public. They crossed into the light of that ballroom, and the room went silent, and Diane saw them. I'd made sure I was standing where I could watch her face. The color left it like a tide pulling back, fast, complete, absolute. Her champagne flute tilted in her hand. I reached over without looking at her and steadied it. "Walter," she said, and her voice came out thin, barely there. "I went to Corey," I said quietly, not for the room, for her. "3 weeks ago, I sat with your mother and father in their kitchen on Sycamore Street. Your father has a defibrillator now, Diane. You didn't know that, because there was nobody left to tell you." Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Your dad ran that hardware store for 31 years before he had to hand it over to your brother because his heart couldn't carry it anymore. Your mother's been mailing you birthday cards to an old address for 6 years. I held the shoebox myself. I let that land. You told my family they were toxic. What they actually are is 2 people who buried their daughter alive and had to keep living next to the grave." I turned toward table 2. Gordon, Ellen. Ellen's hands went flat on the tablecloth, her face going pale in that particular way. People's faces go when a story they trusted collapses out from under them. Gordon sat very still. "I know exactly what she told you. That her real parents were abusive, that they'd passed years ago, and that she needed people to stand in as family so she wouldn't have to walk into a wedding with nobody behind her. She used your decency as a prop to fill 2 empty chairs." I gestured to Harold and Ruth, standing near the door. But those are her real parents. They're both very much alive, and they drove an hour tonight, not knowing if their daughter would ever speak to them again. Ellen looked at Diane, one long look that needed no words, because words wouldn't have been enough. Then she looked at Harold and Ruth, and something crossed her face that was worse than anger. Recognition. The specific recognition of a woman realizing the person she thought she knew does not exist. Gordon didn't say anything. He folded his napkin, set it on the table, and stood, the gesture of a man who has decided there is nothing left worth saying. I turned back to Diane one last time. She'd stopped looking for an exit. There wasn't one, and she knew it. She just looked at me, eyes bright, jaw tight, the entire architecture of everything she'd built reflected on every face in that room. I grew up watching my father treat people, all people, like they mattered, I said. The man who plowed our lot in winter, the woman who cleaned our shop floors, the retired hardware store owner in Kari who gave everything and got told it wasn't enough. I reached into my jacket pocket. That's the measure I was raised on. Not the address, not the job, not the china pattern. By that measure, Diane, I don't know who you are. I took the ring off her finger, gently, and set it on the white tablecloth in front of her. Not thrown, not dramatic. Then I picked up the small bouquet of white carnations that had been sitting at our table, simple flowers, Barbara's favorite, and I crossed the room to where Ruth Whitfield stood. She was fighting it. I could see the effort in her jaw, in her shoulders, in the careful way she was breathing, short and controlled. The way people breathe when they're holding something enormous and can't afford to drop it in public. I put the flowers in her hands. She looked at them, looked at me, then looked at Harold, sitting in his chair having driven an hour not knowing what waited for him, and she came apart completely. Not a scream. A sound like something finally being set down after 6 years of carrying it. Harold reached up and took her hand before the first sound even finished leaving her. His jaw was tight, his eyes wet, his chin steady. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He rolled his wheelchair forward, one length, and extended his free hand toward me. I shook it. He gripped it hard, the grip of a man saying something his voice still couldn't quite manage. I held it a moment. Then I stepped back. My daughter Kristen was suddenly beside me. I hadn't noticed her move. Barbara's daughter shows up when it matters. That's simply what she does. She looked at Ruth for a long moment, and then she wrapped both arms around her, the kind of hug that doesn't ask permission first. We walked out together, the Kowalskis and the Whitfields, my daughter's arm linked through Ruth's, my brother-in-law Merrick pushing Harold's chair without being asked, my nephews holding doors. Merrick paused once at the ballroom entrance and looked back. I looked back too. Diane was still sitting at the head table in her wedding dress, in the perfectly built life she'd constructed, the ring sitting on the linen in front of her, the flowers gone. Gordon and Ellen Marsh were already near the coat check. Ellen's coat half on, Gordon's hand at the small of her back, neither one looking toward Diane as they walked out. The whole circle she'd built her second identity around, the friends, the foundation board members, the people she'd performed for, sat frozen in their chairs with the particular discomfort of people who've just witnessed something they will never be able to unsee and don't know what to do with their hands. Nobody went to her. Nobody pulled her aside. Nobody offered her a version of this that made it better. There was no one left to play a part, because every part had just walked out the door. She just sat there, finally, irreversibly, seen. Outside, on the sidewalk under the old marquee lights of the cultural center, the October air was sharp and clean, and downtown Scranton moved around us like it had no idea what had just happened inside. I stood next to my daughter and breathed for a minute. She put her hand on my shoulder, something she's done since she was small enough that I had to bend down for it. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, Grandpa would have done the same thing. That was it. That was all she said, and it was enough. Across the sidewalk, Harold Whitfield sat in his chair, looking out at the lit-up storefronts of downtown Scranton, Ruth's hand resting on his shoulder, the white carnations still in her lap. They breathed the same sharp autumn air as the rest of us, like two people who'd just been handed back something they'd stopped believing they'd ever see again. Harold caught me looking and gave me one nod, not a thank you, something there isn't quite a word for. I nodded back. Some deals you close for profit. Some you close because there's no version of yourself you can live with if you walk away from the table. That night, I closed the most important deal of my life, and I didn't make a dime off it. Some people erase the ones who love them to make room for a better story. Diane built an entire second life on top of that erasure, and on a cold Saturday night in October, in a rented ballroom in downtown Scranton, every floor of it came down at once. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from tonight. I'll see you in the next one.